Welcome to our workshop today on understanding worries and fears in children for our Tunbridge schools. Before we start, I'll introduce myself. My name's Dr. Katie Gulliver. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm the education lead for the emotional wellbeing teams in Kent and the emotional support teams in Medway. I'll hand over to my colleague Jodie.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jodie Allen. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm the locality lead for Maidstone, Tunbridge and Tunbridge Wells.
And we've
Hello.
also... Yep, go Clementine.
Hello, I'm Clementine Pitsey-Gray. I'm the assistant psychologist for West Kent.
And Christiane.
Hello, my name is Christiane and I'm also assistant psychologist for West Kent.
And we've also got Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a senior emotional wellbeing practitioner in West Kent.
And we've got Anne-Marie.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist based in Medway.
And we've also got Lorraine.
Hello, I'm Lorraine Griffiths. I'm a project manager at KCC.
Lovely. Okay, so today we are going to cover a bit of setting the scene about our service and the national context, talk about what anxiety is, how to support anxiety in the classroom, next steps in terms of Wave 9 and returning to Tunbridge schools, and take any questions. Hand over to Jodie.
Okay, so as some of you might already be aware, children and young people's mental health has become a national priority for the government, following a number of different reviews and reports, particularly since COVID. I think we've all recognised the need for supporting young people with low mood and anxiety has definitely increased. But even before COVID, things were in place to start developing mental health support teams, of which the Kent teams were some of the first in the country. So we had the 5-year forward view for mental health, which really highlighted a priority of needing to increase mental health care for young people. We then had the white paper Future in Mind, which made this a bit more specific, and we was promoting having better links with schools in particular, so not just having mental health services out in the community, but actually linking with schools, tackling the stigma of mental health, and also really trying to reduce waiting times. Those were some of the key targets from that paper. We also had the green paper, Transforming Children and Young People's Mental Health Provision. And this is where mental health support teams were outlined specifically, as well as a plan for all schools and colleges in the country to identify and train a designated senior mental health lead, of which I think nearly all schools have got that now, if not all. And that's a very important kind of link for us with our service, is that we do a lot of linking in with the senior mental health leads in schools. And then we had the NHS long-term plan as well, which focuses on staffing, recruitment, trying to increase the number of people we have working in the NHS mental health services so that we can better provide our services for more and more young people. And also a big aim of that was to highlight and tackle mental health inequalities. So whether that is children and young people that are, for example, experiencing poverty and are more likely to struggle with their mental health, or children and young people who might find it harder to access services. So we are, trying to adapt services to make sure that they are accessible to everyone, are, doing things, changing the service instead of trying to expect all young people to fit in with traditional ways of working. I should just point out that all these papers talk about mental health support teams. That's what our team is, and that's the national term for our type of work, which we will go into in more detail in terms of what we do. But locally in Kent, we are known as the Emotional Wellbeing Team. That was a name that was chosen by a group of young people when we first started. In Medway, the young people chose Emotional Support Team, but in Kent, we're known as the Emotional Wellbeing Team. So when we work with young people, that's what we call ourselves. Most of our practitioners are known as Emotional Wellbeing practitioners as well. Okay. Next slide, thank you. So there are 3 core functions of mental health support teams, or the Emotional Wellbeing Team. The first, probably most obvious one that people think of the most is that we deliver evidence-based interventions to young people on an individual basis, and we offer targeted groups as well. So these are for mild to moderate mental health problems. If children are experiencing things for a much longer time, or they're having a really big impact on their life and it's getting a bit more severe, then we would link in with CAMHS and kind of step them up. So generally our service is looking at prevention and early intervention, so with that mild to moderate need before things start to escalate. So like I said, we offer individual work, low intensity cognitive behavioural therapy is usually our main port of call, and that can be for things like different forms of anxiety, low mood. We do some workshops on friendships, and we also can work with behavioural difficulties with younger people. So a lot of our primary school work is working with parents, helping to understand children's behaviour and working out how we can kind of meet their needs and hopefully reduce any kind of behaviours that are causing adults stress or problems. We also do group work, so we will do that with young people or parents, and we can do, we can support with things like anxiety. We can kind of assess the self-harm, and then if it's something that's kind of more manageable and we can kind of try and support that young person quite quickly, we might be able to continue doing some work with low mood, for example, or stress reduction. Again, if they're kind of going up into a more severe level of self-harm or other kinds of risk, then we would be signposting to kind of services like CAMHS, or we have excellent charities in the area who can offer more kind of specialist support for that kind of thing. And we have group parenting classes as well for things like, we say conduct disorder, but what that really means is kind of behavioural stuff and communication difficulties. We also, another function of our team, so not just that direct kind of therapeutic type work, another function is that we support the whole school approach. So this is where we work with the senior mental health leads, and we try and work out what's already there in a school. A lot of schools nowadays have counsellors or other workers coming in, ELSAs, that kind of thing. And so we work out kind of what they've already got and how we can fit into that and offer something extra. We also do training for education staff, and we can do consultations and supporting staff to kind of understand mental health, think about individual children that they might be struggling with, giving that kind of support. We can offer support for transition up to secondary school, and we can also help with just kind of supporting the school to monitor well-being on a whole school basis, not just individual young people. And then finally, we also offer our third function is consultation and liaison. So this is where we can kind of remind young people directly. They might need something other than what our service can offer, but we can kind of consult with schools, help them to link in with other services. We try and keep up to date with all the kind of services that are available in the area. It might be that they need something more specialist within the NHS, in which case, we can help schools kind of understand that process and know who to refer to, where to get support, that kind of thing. And hopefully, if needed, we can try and ensure more smoother transitions in between NHS services. So once the more severe need or more complex need has been met, if there's something we can offer in our service, then it's about kind of smoothly transitioning them back into that care, instead of what we often have found in the past is kind of a lot of kind of batting around between different services, which is really difficult for the families and young people and the school staff that are supporting them as well. So we're trying to minimise that as much as we can. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of our work is based on the CYP IAPT principles. For anyone that hasn't heard of CYP IAPT, it stands for Children and Young People's Services, and it's improving access to psychological therapies. It's based on adult services that came into play probably about 10 years ago now, all about kind of training up a new workforce and to offer early intervention support for adults with anxiety and low mood. And I can't remember exactly how many years ago, I think it was about 5, 6, 7 years ago, we started the CYP IAPT services were started as well for young people. And these are the kind of core values that really underpin a lot of the work that we do. So there's accessibility. We really want to ensure that everyone is able to access the service in a timely way, and getting support that is evidence-based, that's the most appropriate for them. This might look different for different people. In fact, it often does. And one of the advantages of our type of service is that we can try and kind of tailor things to make sure that that young person is getting something that's helpful for them and not just what the service offers standard to everyone. It's also about increasing awareness. So increasing awareness of mental health, of what that might look like for young people, what that looks like for themselves, and also for parents and other adults, professionals working with them, to kind of be able to recognise mental health problems, but also around reducing stigma and understanding that actually we all experience stress and low mood and anxiety, and there's nothing wrong with seeking help if you're starting to struggle a bit more. A really big thing is participation as well, which is around involving young people in every level of the service. So trying to make sure that services are designed with young people's opinions in mind, that we are kind of talking to young people and the wider school community on a regular basis to make sure that when we're planning things and implementing things, that we're doing things, in a way that does seem accessible and useful for young people. And then we also include them in evaluation. So we're really keen to make sure that we are, this kind of comes into accountability. We want to know how we're doing. Are we doing something that's seeming helpful for young people? Are we having an impact on their mental health problems? Are we having an impact on their goals, on their general level of well-being, on their relationships with their family? So we really try and look at kind of lots of different elements to make sure that we are making impact in some way for that young person. And it also enables us to kind of show as a service as a whole how we're doing. Are we useful? Are we kind of making an impact on a kind of Medway-wide level? And also kind of accountability is very much around clinical governance as well, record keeping, making sure that we keep to a very high standard with those sorts of things. And then finally, evidence-based practice underpins all of the work that we do. So we look at, there's kind of 3 pillars to evidence-based practice. There's research evidence, professional kind of experience, and also the young person and family's experience and opinions. And we look at that when we're kind of choosing interventions to work with people. We make sure that we're backed up by lots of good evidence, that we know that this stands a good chance of helping this young person. But we also want to kind of be able to offer choice and preference for young people. So we like to have options available that are all going to be hopefully kind of equally well evidenced. And that means that the young people can kind of choose which one seems to suit them best. Next slide, please, Katie. Thank you. Okay, so this is our sort of journey. I mentioned that Kent was involved with the very first wave of the mental health support teams. So in January 2019, we had the 2 Trailblazer teams. There were a few others in the country, but ours were in Dartford, Gravesham and Swanley and Swale. And then since then, we have grown basically every year, normally twice a year with different waves. We're linked with 2 different universities, and a big part of what we do is we train up a new workforce of education mental health practitioners or emotional wellbeing practitioners. And so we have a new cohort of trainees twice a year, so that we can kind of have lots of new staff who are trained in these evidence-based practices, so that we can offer support across lots more schools each time. Now we've got Tunbridge, where we are kind of expanding again. And yes, this is up to date with January 2023, but in September this year, we are expanding to Tunbridge and a few other teams in Kent, and Medway, and then in January, we've got some more teams as well. The aim is for mental health support teams to cover 50% of schools by the end of 2024. That's a national aim. And I think, Katie, we're well on track for that, aren't we? So, you know, we want to be able to try and continue to expand, I think, hopefully, so that, you know, ideally, we want all schools to have coverage, but at the moment, we're on track with that target for half the schools in 2024. Now, as some of you might be aware, Tunbridge originally was starting in September 2021 at the same time as Tunbridge Wells. We had to pause that, but this is why we're now coming back into Tunbridge in wave 9 in September, and we will be focusing on 2 trainee schools to begin with. So while we're training our staff up, they will be focusing mainly on 2 specific schools for their placements and their learning. And then it will be once they've completed their training, we will expand into the other schools in Tunbridge that have expressed interest and been agreed with the education team. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is kind of the main stuff we do. I've already kind of touched on this a little bit. We have the whole school approach, kind of encompassing everything we do, but that specifically looks like group interventions, liaison and consultation with staff, tailored interventions, kind of one-to-one or small groups, and and individual interventions one-to-one. So we have workshops that we do with whole classes, we do assemblies. You know, we're looking at increasing people's knowledge about mental health, reducing that stigma by doing it to large groups of children, so that everyone's involved, everyone's understanding and seeing this being normalised. But then for those children where they might have more of a specific need that you as staff are noticing, we can offer more tailored interventions. So it might be like a little workshop for specific children that we would call a targeted workshop. It could be a targeted group, which would be a longer intervention, or an individual intervention. It really varies across different schools what we tend to offer. So some schools really like our whole school approach stuff, and we tend to offer them more of things like assemblies and whole class workshops, and that seems to work better. And then there are other schools where, particularly like secondary schools, we tend to offer a little bit more one-to-one, but we're really keen to increase access, because obviously if we're doing a targeted group, we can support a lot more children, and we're offering them a really good quality intervention where they can also meet other people that are going through something similar to them. So we're really keen on our groups, on our workshops, but we also, I think everyone enjoys the individual work as well. Okay, next slide, please, Katie. Yeah. So who do we work with? Again, I've already kind of covered this, but the whole idea behind the whole school approach, I think this is something that as a service we're really passionate about. I know Katie, as our education lead, is kind of really looking at making sure that we are kind of sticking to a whole school approach in practice across the whole school. So that's the children and young people, it's the school staff, and that's not just the mental health lead or the SENCO or the DSL, it's all school staff. We want to be able to support, offering training, offering consultation and advice, and then parents and carers as well. This is something that, particularly for primary schools, we can offer a lot of different things for parents and carers. For secondary schools, we're developing things, we're in pilot projects, for example, where we're looking at prevention and getting parents involved in understanding their children's well-being, that kind of thing. The whole point is that for our more targeted work, we are looking at focusing with a focus on prevention. So even before people are experiencing anything near a diagnosable mental health problem, we're looking at kind of just generally maintaining healthy well-being and a good sense of how we can help ourselves, look after ourselves, self-care, that kind of thing. And then also early intervention. So like I was saying earlier, when young people, you might start to notice someone's looking a bit more withdrawn, they're getting a bit quieter, they might start to be avoiding things, or you're noticing them worrying quite a lot. We want to try and support them at that time when we're, there's still a lot of flexibility. We can give them some really good advice, help them work out what's going to work best for them, help them find some goals to work towards, and reach their potential. And that's our kind of sweet spot, really, where our work works really well. When you've got children that are maybe experiencing a little bit more severe issues, or there's a lot of stuff going on, maybe there's like a crisis in the family, our types of strategies might not be quite so helpful in that moment. So we'd be probably using more of our consultation there, helping you as school staff to work out kind of what is going to be most helpful for them. Maybe some other services that can offer something like counselling or supporting the family. So that would be kind of where we would, really be trying to support those sorts of young people if we can't work with them directly, or if, at that time, if we feel like something else is going to suit them a lot better. Okay, I think this is Katie.
Thanks, Jodie. So moving to think more specifically about children's fears and worries and about anxiety now. Firstly, some context, really. There's no single cause of anxiety. Several factors can lead to its development, including a mixture of genetic and environmental factors. Anxiety can run in families, so there might be a vulnerability, but the environment also plays a massive part in that. So thinking about the environment, the last couple of years, or 3 years now, have had a massive impact on young people's mental health and well-being, and specifically a lot around anxiety. We've seen a 77% rise in the number of children requiring treatment for severe, mental health crises over the pandemic. And the probable category of mental health disorder, so that's from a national survey looking at lots of young people, has risen now to 1 in 6, where it was 1 in 9 before the pandemic. So obviously, COVID has had a massive impact on children's levels of anxiety. You'll know that, you'll see that in schools. They've missed out a lot of their social development. And we've obviously seen a large rise in school-based anxiety when children were returning back to the classroom after large periods of time at home. As I said, this all makes complete sense because of the context that we've been in. And it's not surprising that our children have experienced a lot of stress and worry, and they've also probably witnessed people around them feeling stressed and worried and anxious as well. And so that can have that sort of contagion effect, if you like. So, understandably, if their parents are anxious, they're going to pick up on that, even if they tried very hard to keep shelter their children from the impact of the pandemic. They will have sensed what's gone on. It was a kind of national anxiety. And you as, school staff were also under a huge amount of pressure and stress. So it's kind of everybody really has been impacted. So it's not surprising that we are seeing a large amount of anxiety. And it's important to note that that is, because it's not surprising, that's normal and not necessarily something that they need support with, which I'll come on to a bit more. But just in terms of the context and the environment, there's also these more recently, quite a large other factors that are likely to be increasing children's anxiety that they're picking up on in the news or aware of: the cost of living crisis, climate change. There's a lot of discourse around young people around their kind of fear and worry about the impact of climate change on the environment. They're the people that will be having to face the kind of biggest impacts, really, because they're the youngest, and they're very aware of that. We've had the Black Lives Matter movement. Young people are much more engaged in kind of political and social, sort of aware of kind of social issues than they were perhaps when they were in the past, when we were young, because they've got so much more access to the media and social media. And obviously we've had the war in Ukraine as well recently. So it's not surprising that all those different factors are there in the background, and young people are kind of being faced with them with not necessarily the capacity to regulate or understand the impact of that. So it's not surprising that we're seeing a lot more anxiety in young people and in the classroom, really. So thinking about how to recognise and support young people with anxiety. It's important to distinguish here that not all young people who experience difficulties would necessarily meet a diagnostic criteria for an anxiety disorder, or would necessarily need support. So this quote here from Peter Fonagy, who's a very well-known and renowned psychologist and researcher in the area, and author on young people's mental health problems. He's written here, there are two issues that have got terribly tangled up together. There are students who are mentally ill, as he calls it, who need help and support. And there are students who are having a difficult time, aren't coping well, and they've diagnosed themselves as being unwell. So the problem with wider access to information and awareness of wellbeing and mental health is sometimes young people are kind of self-diagnosing what we would have perhaps in the past just categorised as having a difficult time. And so those young people obviously need support from their families and from schools, but they don't necessarily need therapy or mental health support as a sort of broader context. And so it's quite hard to unpick that. But it's important to remember that not all young people who are anxious will need necessarily extra one-to-one intervention. But we can think about how a school environment could support anxiety, how you as teachers can kind of support anxiety when it pops up in the classroom, and we can support parents to think about how they can support anxiety when it pops up, because it's important to remember that it is a normal human response and emotion. And given all those contextual factors, it's not surprising that a lot of young people are feeling that normal emotional response at the moment. So it's just important to be kind of aware of language, and that's why we sort of titled the thing about the workshop today about fears and worries, because they're perhaps more normalised words for what's got mixed up with an emotion, a normal emotional response that we all have, versus a problem or a difficulty or a disorder. Lots of young people do experience stress and anxiety, so hopefully some tips from today will help you feel able to kind of manage that within the classroom or within the school environment, and feel kind of more equipped to manage that, and to notice perhaps when that distinction occurs. So what's that normal response, which needs a bit of extra support but doesn't necessarily need one-to-one help or therapy, and what's more of a difficulty. We will say, though, we promote kind of bringing those children and asking that question, and we can help you think together about that. That doesn't mean necessarily that we're expecting you to kind of diagnose or know as school staff when that distinction occurs, but it's just helpful to bear in mind that that distinction is there, and so we might sometimes be helping you think about that, or think about how we can as a whole school promote wellbeing, rather than needing to access that sort of one-to-one support. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so as I've already said, anxiety is a normal human response designed to facilitate self-protection. It's our body's response to threat or danger. While it can feel horrible and uncomfortable, and it does, it isn't harmful. It's a normal emotion that can be useful and can enhance our performance. I think you've probably seen that kind of concept of the stress curve, and actually a little bit of stress or anxiety can help performance, help us achieve optimally. And so we need anxiety, and historically it's kept us safe. However, it can become a problem when it becomes too much or interferes with our day-to-day life, and it can have a big impact on our functioning, and that's when we need to listen to it and offer extra support for young people where that's getting to that point where it's impacting their functioning. It's important to note that 70% of children worry. There's lots of different common worries, which I'll come on to in the next slide, and those worries are often linked to their age or stage of development. For example, initially they might have had worries about fears of loud noises, strangers, things like that. Then it comes on to kind of separation anxiety. And then as they get older, those fears and worries become more complex, more around kind of social worries, more around rejection, more around kind of comparison with peers, fears of failure, or more significant dangerous events happening to people that they love. Yeah, well, I'll come on to that table in a second. So as I said, here's the table. So as you can see, the sort of typical worries for a small child would be things like loud noises, things that make them jump, anything out of their control, strangers, people in costume. There's all those classic kind of photos at Christmas, aren't there, of the baby being thrust at Santa and in loads of tears. That's terrifying to a small child. Yeah, so kind of those are normal fears for a 0 to 2-year-old, and as I said, as they get older they become more complex. So if you're thinking about a young primary school age child, they will be having separation anxiety, perhaps having bad dreams and nightmares, often still worries about things like monsters, ghosts, witches, natural events like fire and thunder and lightning and the dark and things like that. And as they get older, those become more complex. Into that, as I said, those small social anxiety worries like being rejected or not liked, or something bad happening to themselves, people or pets they care about. So as they start understanding that concept of mortality and danger and the accidents and things like that can happen and risk, they start to worry that those will happen to people they care about. And then they sort of experience that those bad things do happen, but it's very rare, and that kind of context helps that worry kind of die down often as they get older. But as they get to sort of secondary school age, they might be frightened about things that they hear on the news, like the war in Ukraine, for example. They might be, or the climate change crisis, they might be having some fears around, again, someone getting hurt who's close to them. But those more social things as well become more complex, about their peers. And then also things like school pressures, so exams, failing, not being able to succeed after school, whatever that looks like. So as you can see, those are all very typical worries, and we think that's helpful to remind people about, because quite often you'll hear those worries and that's not necessarily a problem. We'll come on to kind of how to listen and support when those worries pop up, but quite often that support and kind of gentle conversation and emotional support is enough. It's when that becomes more overwhelming, more persistent, kind of taking up to their time, impacting their functioning, that's when it becomes a difficulty. So just to connect to that experience, that we all feel anxious and that we all kind of have those physical sensations of anxiety. I'd just like you to look at these 3 scenarios here. One will jump more for you than others, I think. Some people will be fine looking at that spider, other people that will set off that physical reaction. So you kind of look at those pictures and see you're sitting on the sofa, you look up and there's the spider. That's fine for me, but for others, yeah, like I say, you'll notice that physical sensations kicking in. This one's probably mine, or the next one actually, although thankfully we don't have Ofsted, we have CQC instead. But yeah, sitting down waiting for a job interview, or you know that there's an inspector kind of coming through the door, that might set off that physical sensation of anxiety for you. So you'll notice that your heart might start racing, you might feel a bit sweaty, dry mouth, butterflies, those kind of things. Notice what you feel in your body if you put yourself in one of those scenarios. Notice what thoughts are going through your head. Notice what your kind of urge is. It might be an urge to kind of run or hide or things like that from those situations. That is a normal anxiety response, which I'm sure you can all connect to from one of those situations. Okay, I'll pass over to Clementine now, I think. Oh. There we go.
So I'm going to be talking about how does anxiety work. So I'm going to be talking about the fight, flight or freeze response, which you may have heard of before. So this is when we're in danger and our brain releases certain hormones to trigger that fight, flight or freeze response. So this response is an evolutionary programmed response to help us avoid or escape from danger and keep us safe. So this is something that is very ancient within our brains, and a number of changes happen in our body when the flight, fright, freeze response is triggered. Something that would be good for you to think about is, can you recognize this behavior from young people in your classroom? So next slide, please, Casey. So this slide is discussing thinking about how the flight, fright and freeze response may present itself in the physical sensations that we all may feel. So, for example, feeling dizzy or lightheaded, having thoughts racing, maybe rapid shallow breathing, feeling that your heart's beating faster, feeling sick or having a tummy ache, which is a really common one. It's also thinking about, maybe there are butterflies in your stomach, shaking knees, sweating palms, your muscles are very tense. So all of these things can be the physical way that the anxiety is actually presenting in your body. So the other element is the cognitive component. So this is when you're appraising the risk. So feeling worried or anxious can also lead to unhelpful thinking. So faced with an anxiety-provoking situation, children typically overestimate the chance of danger and underestimate their ability to cope. So, for example, things may seem a lot scarier from, for example, an 8-year-old's point of view, if they're worried about being on their own at lunch. For them, this would be really scary, and the idea of being alone may make them experience worry around coping about being alone and not knowing how to manage this. So some of the outward things that you may recognise within your own young people, students, or even yourself might be the fight or flight responses. So anxiety is not always easy to spot and can be masked by other emotions and behaviours, and we may not always recognise that the fears sit beneath actually what we're seeing and what behaviours we're seeing. So some of the common things that we would say to look out for is children and young people being confrontational, explosive outbursts, refusal maybe to do things or follow instructions, difficulty sharing, agitation, maybe active avoidance, and maybe being controlling. Some of the other inward responses, so thinking about the freeze responses, which is important to note that anxiety can present themselves in this inward response, which is similar to this freeze response, but actually can be difficult to notice. So these behaviours could be over-compliance, agreeing to things without tasks, or being robotically good to avoid detection. Withdrawing, avoiding interaction with others. Maybe they're low in energy or disengaged. Disrupted sleeping and eating. So this is something which, you see a lot. I think you'll know yourself, maybe if you're very worried, it can be difficult to get off to sleep, or you might have patterns of waking up. Physical symptoms such as headaches, tummy aches and sickness. So complaints of those physical illness, which may not be due to a physical reason, but actually anxiety. So something that I think Katie mentioned earlier is thinking about this curve. So when is anxiety helpful? So with all of this in mind, it can be useful to think about how anxiety is a normal evolutionary response, and therefore it does serve a helpful function. Maybe if you can take a little bit of time to think of when there might be a time in your life when anxiety has actually been helpful to you. So this graph represents what happens to our bodies when we're anxious and when we're in the optimum phase of worry. So anxiety can sometimes be useful in helping increase motivation and prepare you to face challenges. So research has actually shown that students and athletes who experience some anxiety actually display an improved performance on tests or while participating in competitive sports. So anxiety can also be a helpful motivator for actors feeling maybe stage fright before performing, or as discussed earlier with Katie's image, before a job interview. So having a small amount of anxiety may help us to better prepare for the job interview, for example, by ensuring we research the company beforehand. However, if we have too much anxiety, we may find it difficult to function, and this is when anxiety becomes more unhelpful. In addition, anxiety can act as a warning to real danger in your lives in order to keep you safe. For example, if you were trying to cross a road and a car came at speed from around the corner, that anxiety would help prepare you quickly for flight or get you out of the way. So actually that hormone release within your brain will help your muscles to get that blood and energy that it needs to get you out of that situation. So anxiety can also alert you to pay more attention to your current situation and make any necessary changes to your life. For example, an adult might be finding that the job is causing a great deal of stress. If children can recognise their anxiety as a warning sign, then they can communicate this better and then find ways to feel better. So for example, playing a game, asking an adult for support. And our aim is to help children to be in the optimum range, where they may still feel worried, but feel able to cope with it. Anxiety symptoms can be difficult to manage, but learning to cope with these feelings is a real opportunity for self-growth. So thinking about when is anxiety unhelpful? So anxiety can also become unhelpful when it's experienced for long periods of time or very frequently. And this can result in the brain losing its ability to switch off these false alarms. So anxiety is a problem when it negatively impacts a person's mood and behaviour. For example, we may become more irritable and respond differently to everyday situations in ways that are unhelpful or actually may make you feel worse. And long-term anxiety often coexists with low mood and self-esteem. So my lecturers always said they were best friends. So anxiety is a problematic when it interferes with everyday life, such as a child getting to school. So what keeps anxiety going? So the things to really be on alert for as school staff is thinking avoidance is a common and natural response to anxiety-provoking situations. And we often tend to avoid situations that make us feel anxious. However, what happens when we avoid? So while avoidance helps us in the short term, as we don't feel the effects of our anxiety, it does end up maintaining the anxiety, as we do not get the opportunity to realise that these physical symptoms are harmless. we also do not get the chance to learn the skills for coping with this anxiety. And the longer we put off doing something, the harder it becomes. For example, I'm sure many of you know leaving the washing up for too long and then the pile gets bigger, or maybe, not folding all your laundry and the pile gets bigger. Have you had any examples of times when children or young people, or maybe someone else, that has avoided something due to those feelings of anxiety? We also see reassurance seeking. So this is also a common and natural response to anxiety. And reassurance maintains the anxiety, as it only relieves the anxiety briefly, and also reinforces the message that there is a danger to be protected from, when it really is actually the anxiety that's driving the reassurance seeking. So it's normal to want to reassure children, especially if they're anxious. However, reassurance sometimes does not help the child to feel less anxious in the long run, because the reassurance can actually act as being addictive. So the more the child gets reassurance, the more they'll want it and believe that they actually need it. So children need to be able to feel that they can deal with fears themselves and are able to test out for themselves whether or not their worried thoughts are accurate. Another thing we see is safety behaviours. We might also engage in safety behaviours, which are what we think will help us keep safe from an anxiety-provoking situation. So, for example, only going shopping at quiet times of day, wearing headphones, covering mouth when talking, avoiding eye contact. So while these behaviours work in the short term, they allow our beliefs to remain unchallenged, and we do not get the opportunity to learn that the feared outcome would not have occurred. By identifying these for ourselves and with our children, we can encourage them to refrain from engaging in them when facing their fears. Thank you. So something that Katie mentioned, has been increasing, particularly since the pandemic, is this school-based anxiety. So many children and young people worry about school, and this is normal. Anxieties are a part of life, and learning to deal with them is part of growing up. However, sometimes a child's worries may lead to difficulties in attending school. So if your child has high levels of anxiety and does not want to attend school, they may be experiencing emotion-based school avoidance. So it's very important to help these children overcome these difficulties as soon as possible. Absences mean, obviously, that children, as you know, miss out on learning and making friendships, and it does make it more difficult when they come back after a long period of being off. So this diagram shows how emotionally based social avoidant behaviours can develop. And for example, these can develop from maybe a peer relationship and having fallen out with a friend. So we may have anxious feelings about school. So maybe then they develop into negative thoughts about school and then one's ability to cope, which leads to avoidance of the situation that's invoking the anxiety. So then we may avoid going, but immediately the anxiety reduces, but then it increases the school avoidance and it continues.
Thanks, Clementine. So now we've kind of covered what anxiety is and when it can become a problem and when it's helpful. It's now time to think about how schools can support young people with worries and fears and anxiety. So the first thing to think about is the classroom. How to make the classroom an environment which reduces the impact of anxiety, especially things like sensory challenges as well, which can come alongside anxiety. So, for example, making that the environment not too under or overstimulating for children. If you sit in an average classroom, it's helpful to think about kind of how much noise that environment is. Often they are quite kind of echoey places. Things like the canteen exam is also can be quite quite loud environments, thinking about kind of smells, sounds, and all the other senses as well, really, especially things like the lighting. So it can be really helpful for all children to think about what that environment's like, and making sure that it's a not too stimulating or too boring an environment, kind of getting that sweet spot in the middle, really. And that will help all children, regardless of whether they suffer from anxiety or sensory challenges or not, really. So that's a really important starting point, to really think about the environment and how to improve that. And that obviously is a challenge when you're confined by the buildings that you have, which I know some will be, perhaps quite, for some of the primary schools, they're quite old buildings, so it's kind of thinking about how you can do that in a not very costly way, because I know that there isn't budget for lots of renovation of classrooms, but just having that little think about, well, is there something we can put over the lighting so it's not so bright? Can we put a rug in here so it soaks up a bit of that noise? Can we just think about the sounds and smells that are going on, using blinds, those sorts of things, just to try and kind of reduce that input, really. It's also important to have calm zones and quiet play areas. Now, lots of you will already do this, and Nurture UK is working with Kent to think about kind of that, to provide training for all schools in Kent. So you're welcome to attend that training if you have not done so, and that will help. I know throughout that training that helps think about those areas and how to establish those kind of nurturing, quiet play areas and zones within the classroom that offer that safety. Anxious children often feel overwhelmed by the vastness of the playground, or if they're scared of getting hurt by other children, or quite overwhelmed by the large amounts of children. So making sure there are those quiet play areas, providing things like mentoring systems where the peers, the children themselves kind of support the younger children who perhaps are more anxious in the playground. All those kind of programs, which lots of you will already do, can be really helpful in just providing a supportive environment for those children that find school more overwhelming or more anxiety provoking. It's helpful to think about sensory items that you can have within your classroom, having a sensory toolkit which has little tools and strategies that children can access very easily. So lots of schools in their sort of quiet or calm area might have some posters with some basic grounding techniques, like the square breathing or the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding. We're going to come on to them later, so I won't go into depth now, but so you might already have some of those to prompt young people to learn to use those. You might have some sensory items that that they could, like fidget toys, all those sorts of things that and children know they can access when they're feeling overwhelmed, that can just help centre and ground them. And it's important to think about routine changes, which I'm sure, again, you do. And this is often talked about when we're talking about children who might be autistic. But actually, all children need that kind of planning and support around transitions. Lots of you are already very good at this, but it's just remembering the smaller changes that can happen, support around things like when there's a supply teacher, or when for some reason the school day changes, things like sports day. Lots of children love sports day, and it's like the highlight, especially in primary school, not always in secondary, but in primary school, it's the highlight of the year for lots of children. But for some, that difference and lack of structure and routine can be really overwhelming. So just thinking about those kind of times throughout the year when that change might happen, and which an anxious child might find more difficult to manage, and just thinking about what you can do to prepare them and forewarn them in advance about that. And again, maybe have some of those quiet spaces if they're needed. Okay, so to sum up kind of what you can do to support young people with anxiety, thinking about what we spoke about before, and what Clementine was speaking about, avoidance being a trap and a difficulty that kind of helps maintain anxiety. The opposite of that is promoting what we call have a go behaviours. So promoting that idea of just giving it a try, and supporting them to try that. And you might do that in a gradual way, and you might do that in a very gentle and supportive way, but it's helping the child learn that actually what they fear will happen won't happen, or won't be as bad as they fear it will. So going back to that anxiety equation that Clementine presented, either building up, reducing the risk, their sense of risk for the child, so it's not very likely to happen, or if it is something that has to happen, like for example putting their hand up in class, helping them learn that actually they coped, it wasn't as bad as they thought it was going to be. We'll come to that a bit more in a minute. It's helpful for you as teachers and support staff to be aware of those possible traps, and what we can easily fall into doing to maintain anxiety, and really promoting positive relationships within school, promoting resilience conversations, and thinking about your whole school approach to wellbeing. So coming on to a bit more detail about the have a go behaviours. So it's helpful to understand this curve here, which is called the habituation curve. Habituation is about sitting with and tolerating discomfort we feel when we feel anxious. It's really important to expose ourselves to the feared situation, to realise it's not harmful, and for our body to learn that as well. So what we think will happen when we face an anxiety-provoking situation is that our anxiety will continue to go up. Those uncomfortable, unpleasant feelings will continue to rise exponentially, and often people fear things like I'll faint or I'll be sick or things like that. Now, those being sick's very rare, and fainting's actually not possible with most types of anxiety because your blood pressure goes up. And our bodies do not maintain that high level of adrenaline and anxiety forever. Typically, in around 20 minutes, that anxiety will start to come down naturally by itself if you stay in that situation. Now, that's pretty horrible 20 minutes, and most of us can think of things which we avoid, which we wouldn't want to sit with for that long. But the more we do that, the quicker that anxiety comes down, and the more our body learns and we learn that it's not a threat, and actually we can face and do that situation. So that habituation naturally occurs. And the more and more we do it, the easier it becomes. I'm sure you can think of situations where that's happened. For example, this presenting, when I first did that was a massively anxiety-provoking thing for me. I get dry mouth, I'd really struggle to kind of talk and that sort of thing. Now I've done so many presentations, I get a tiny bit of nerves beforehand, but I don't feel anxious. And I'm sure you can think of situations like that. And it can be helpful to remind children and use those examples from your own life where you've actually faced something, because there will be some, or even where the child has themselves before. So, you've done this, and actually we know it's never as bad as we think it's going to be, and that anxiety and things get easier, and the more we have a go and the more we try, and that anxiety does come down. So instead of avoiding, it's really helpful to just promote having a go and facing those situations. Now, we wouldn't expect, if a child's really anxious about a situation, we wouldn't expect them to do necessarily the whole thing straight away, or, if they're anxious about putting their hand up and saying one thing, we wouldn't want them to do a massive presentation, for example. So it's you can do that in a graduated small steps way, and helping the child think about that. Explaining this concept to a child can help them. They need to be on board with this, otherwise it can feel quite like you're forcing them, and that's just going to create resistance. So it's really helpful if you can help the child understand this concept, like I say, using ideas and examples where they faced situations in the past and they know that actually it wasn't as bad as they thought it was going to be, or that horrible feeling did go down. So that can help them learn that for next time. So it's just, as I say, really promoting having a go. Okay, so thinking about traps that we can all fall into, because you want the best for your children. So as teachers and support staffs, you want to help children as best you can, but you can fall into these traps. And they match really the things that maintain anxiety that Clementine was spoken about. So colluding with avoidance, jumping to reassurance, lots of don't worries, ignoring or sort of passing on the anxiety because thinking that that will mean it goes away, but actually not responding in that moment, or becoming overprotective of the child. We know that those will maintain anxiety inadvertently. It's very easy to fall into things like reassurance chaps, because our young person will ask you a question, will it be all right? Yes, of course it'll be all right. 5 minutes later, but will it be all right though? And you can just fall into that pattern so easily, because of course you want to give some reassurance. You want the child to feel better, but actually sometimes it can be helpful to turn that back on the child and say, what do you think? And just by that, actually, they know deep down it will be okay, and they're able to kind of answer that themselves, and therefore, you know, learn again that actually they don't need to rely on that adult to keep kind of seeking that reassurance. For example, colluding with reassurance, with avoidance, sorry, for example, we will make reasonable adjustments, and that's all that's needed, and I would promote doing that for that time to help the child access school, for example. So for example, I worked with a young person recently where they were so anxious that they were missing a lot of school, and, you know, starting to have days off sick because they didn't feel that, you know, they would give reports of things like, you know, I felt sick, those sorts of things as their reasons for missing school. And it turned out that what they were very anxious about putting their hands up in class. So we agreed with the school that at that point, the child wouldn't be asked kind of on the spot to answer questions. You know, like, you know, you might do kind of look around the class and be like, Clementine, what's this? That we agreed that all the teaching staff for that child would, because it was secondary school, would not do that kind of on the spot asking. That was enough to reduce the anxiety for that child to go back into classroom. Excellent, that's a good outcome. She's there in lesson. However, we wouldn't want that to then go on forever, because that's not real life, and that's not helping her learn that it is okay to kind of have that slightly anxiety provoking situation where someone says, oh, what's this? Because it's okay to say, I don't know, getting it wrong is not the end of the world, those kind of things that that young person needs to learn. So it's important to kind of, if you do those reasonable adjustments, that there's a review for those, and that there's a sort of time limit around them, and that that will be gradually kind of reduced so that the child kind of can access school in a usual way. Okay. So how do we respond to worries if we're getting a lot of reassurance seeking, lots of worries? What we find with worry is when you kind of give answers, it will just come back. So for example, like a child worrying about a burglar. Will a burglar get in? No, a burglar can't get in. But what if they climbed in that little open window? They wouldn't fit in that window. You can end up in this whole long kind of conversation about this worry, which is highly unlikely, and it's inadvertently giving that reassurance is validating that it is something the child needs to worry about. So what can you do instead? Because people often say that, okay, instead of reassurance, I want to help the child feel emotionally supported. What can I do instead? So the first thing is to notice, validate, and wonder out loud around that worry. Things like, I can see you must be feeling upset about going in the playground today. That must be really difficult. I'm wondering what that might be. So trying to get to that emotion underneath the worry. So the burglar, the child who kept asking about a burglar, sounds like you're really worried. That sounds like that's tricky for you. I'm wondering why you're feeling so worried right now. It's often nothing to do with burglars. It's something else, like they fell out with their friend or something like that. So, and again, just connecting that to that emotion. Offering supportive care. What can I do that would be helpful right now? Obviously they might say, give me reassurance or make me not have to do it, but you can kind of put limits around it. So, you know, we do have to go on that school trip, for example, to a place you're worried about because it's new. We are going on that school trip. What would help you? Would it helpful to have your best friend sitting next to you? Okay, that's something we can do. Would it be helpful to know where it is first? Look at their website first. That's something we can do. So it's kind of what would be reasonable and supportive, but without feeding into that worry. And then showing a genuine interest in the child's emotion and trying to understand. So not belittling those worries either. Oh, you don't need to worry about that. That sort of kind of response, which again, we can automatically fall into. It's validating that child is worried right now. They are feeling anxious or upset right now. Help me understand can be a way to open up that conversation around the emotion that's happening and help them feel emotionally supported whilst not offering that reassurance or avoidance. Okay. Lorraine, I think you're going to speak a little bit about resilience conversations.
I am. Thanks, Katie. Yes,
all
some
right.
of you might be familiar with these already, and might have seen different versions of these. So this is something that Head Start Kent produced alongside schools. Schools really input into the development of these, and they developed a lot over the 5-6 years of when they very started at the beginning. And this is the version on the screen that we use now. The 6 areas in our lives where you can promote resilience in young people that we use here. And they are feeling secure, friendships, talents and interests, education, emotions and behaviours and health. And something that we use with this is a strength-based process that was really important. So to keep it positive. So if young person's having a difficult time that's quite significant in one of these areas, it can really make it hard for them to manage during some difficult times. So the good news is by using this tool, there's many things that can be done to strengthen those areas, but also maybe boost some other areas as well, which will make them feel easier to bounce back when it's feeling difficult. And this, as I said, this has been tried and tested with schools and community organisation, and they've been really positive and said it's really helped them to unpick some things with a young person, that something that they weren't even aware of has sometimes come out of that discussion. As sometimes you focus on one area because you're aware of it, but actually by looking at all these different 6 areas, it can identify something new that you weren't aware of and that they were worried about. It's easy to use with children and young people, and all staff can use it. It's really self-explanatory, and there's a self-reflection tool that young people can do themselves and answer the questions, and then can have that conversation based around their answers. It's all available on the Kent Resilience Hub, and the link is on the screen, but also you'll find it by typing in resilience conversation on the hub. And remember that supporting young people with anxiety is everyone's responsibility. So we do want all staff to be able to access this tool and have that opportunity, as sometimes young people choose who they want an adult to have a conversation with, and it might not always be the person that's obvious. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Lorraine. Right, Christiane, you're going to talk about relaxation and grounding techniques. You there, Christiane?
I'm sorry, as always, I forget. Thank you. Using relaxation and grounding techniques can help a child to manage the physical sensations that can come with anxiety and help them to let their hypothetical worries go. One example is the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding exercise. And the idea is to use your 5 senses to tune to the present and tune to the present. So, for example, you can look around your environment and find 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, 1 thing that you can taste. Another technique is the star breathing technique. And it just, as you follow the star, you breathe in up the line. When you reach the top, you hold. As you go down, you breathe out. As you go up again, you breathe in. And then when you reach the top, you hold again. And you continue the process throughout this time, as long as I wish. There are also child-friendly muscle relaxation techniques you can use with your children at home, such as squeezing a lemon, standing as tall as a giraffe, turtle hiding in your shelf, ringing toes in sand. It's really important to practice these strategies when children are not feeling anxious. So when they really feel anxious, they know exactly what to do. Next, please. It's also important when we look at tips and techniques for anxiety to remember that anxiety is bigger than one person. As a school, we want to work to ensure that young people can come forward and seek support when needed. In order to help somebody experience anxiety, the young person's parents, young person's friends, and the staff at the school all need to play a role. We need to take a whole school approach in order to work with anxiety. Considering this idea of the whole school approach, these are the 10 ways that children and young people want the school to support their mental health. Number 1, every child knows who is responsible for and can help with mental health issues. Number 2, every adult in the school offers a good first response if I say or I show I'm struggling with my mental health. Number 3, bullying is dealt with effectively. Number 4, empower us to understand and take a role in caring for our mental health. Number 5, extra support for young people that are struggling. Number 6, emotional and practical support during busy, stressful times. Number 7, a place to go on hard days. Number 8, signposting to support in your area and beyond. Number 9, young person involvement in making the school more mentally healthy. And number 10, recognize us as individuals. I'll pass over to my colleague now.
Thanks, Christiane. Okay, so to summarise, our take-home messages about anxiety are: experiencing anxiety or fear or worry is part of the human condition. It is normal, and it can be problematic. Demystifying the experience of anxiety can reduce the fear attached to the experience. So those horrible physical sensations can be scary, but if children understand that's what they are, this is my body feeling anxious, this is my brain thinking there's a danger, that sort of language, that can reduce that fear around the response. Understanding and recognising anxiety can inform responses, and responding to anxiety doesn't only happen in a therapy room, it's in our everyday interactions, and there is support available for US schools around that. Jodie.
Thank you. So yeah, just to summarise in terms of what we offer as well to your schools. So we can offer online workshops for parents around understanding their children's anxiety, and this is something that we open up to all of our schools in Kent. We send those links around regularly. You also have something called Aussie, which is an online guided self-help for parents. It's a lovely program. You get regular contact with a practitioner for kind of brief check-ins, but a lot of it is kind of self-led, so it works really well for parents that are very busy during working hours. We have groups for parents around supporting their children with worries and fears, or with their behaviour. We have one-to-one support for parents and children as well, and we have workshops and training for staff. Then for secondary schools, we have targeted support for young people, either one-to-one or in a group, online workshops for young people. We're starting some of those over the summer, and workshops and assemblies in schools for the young people, and workshops for staff as well. So that's just a snapshot, but yeah, we want to be able to offer this and kind of tailor it to what individual schools most need at a particular time. Thanks, Katie. Here are some really lovely resources that we signpost to regularly. So we've got the Kent Resilience Hub, the Anna Freud Centre. Anna Freud were really involved in the creation of mental health support teams, so we use a lot of their resources. There's some great stuff specifically designed for schools, so I recommend you guys checking out that website. And we also have our own website for our specific service and our NHS Trust and ELFT in general. We've got some resources on there, videos that explain our service, kind of what we do, and yeah, other services in the NHS as well, all available on there. Thanks, Katie. I think next slide is back to Christiane, is it? Or is this me as well?
Back to Christiane, I think.
Yeah, it's me. Thank you. I'm just gonna talk about looking after ourselves. Our automatic response as teaching staff can be to keep on plodding. It's so common for school staff to prioritize the children's care and learning, so it can feel quite odd to stop and think, what do I need? It's so important to first take care of yourselves. You cannot pour from empty cup, as says there on the picture. Fit your own mask oxygen first. You are not used to anyone if you are running on empty. Caring for yourself first is often the best thing you can do in order to help others. It isn't selfish or egocentric, just really good advice. So make time for yourself. You are really important. Perhaps you should take a moment and think, how good are you at prioritize your own needs? What do you do for your own self-care? It might be that you like seeing friends, having a hobby, regular exercising, eating healthily, not drinking too much alcohol, using other support networks. Next slide, please. There are also local services that offer free psychological therapies. So this would involve a GP referral or individual complete a referral form from the relevant website. And these are the websites on the slide: Insight Healthcare, Porchlight, Mental Wellbeing Information Hub, and We Are With You. Thank you.
Over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you. Yes. Just to make you aware of just a couple of opportunities that are coming up that you might not have heard of already. We've been setting up some children and young people emotional wellbeing and mental health networks, and the plan is by September we'll have one in all of 12 districts in Kent. And the Tunbridge and Moorland one just started, actually. We've had one meeting already, which was held at Tunbridge Girls Grammar School, which went really well. The next one will be in the new academic year, so we'll be keeping you posted on new dates and send you out posters to keep you in the loop. They're face-to-face at the moment, and we also have an online one which will be running in July, which is around the topic of anxiety as well, and that's online, so you can join that, and it is recorded, so if you can't attend you can watch the video after. I think there's another slide and I might have just covered both in one. Oh no, I didn't. If you're not already, I think you're already on our mailing list already just through these events, so you should find out. But you can find out more about these district meetings and watch past videos and dates of other meetings, and the Wellbeing for Schools bulletin, which you should also receive as well. There's more available in information on our website at the bottom there. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. So as we've said, next steps will be we're recruiting right now, literally right now. We're interviewing for our new EMHPs starting in Tunbridge today and this week. And so we will be starting, as Jodie's already said, in 2 training schools in September, and then the following September, those 4 education mental health practitioners will be trained, and we will be coming out into the Tunbridge schools which are part of the programme. You will be invited to a launch workshop for Tunbridge schools in term 1, and those details will follow. If you've got any questions about anything from today, that is our email, which is EWT and EST inquiries at nelft.nhs.uk, or also via Lorraine's team, she can get questions to us as well. Thank you very much for listening.